I heard Chris Christie lost his job. They fired Chris Christie. And they have a great young woman taking his place who happens to be Hispanic and happens to be phenomenal. She's going to do a great job. But they fired Chris Christie. I guess, you know why? He wanted to eat all the time. No, they fired him.
What you just witnessed in that clip from a Trump rally was not an aberration or an isolated moment of poor taste, but rather the crystallized essence of what the Republican Party has become under his dominion. And if you feel your stomach turning and your blood pressure spiking watching this man mock someone for their weight and lost employment while a crowd howls and cheers around him like deranged spectators at some gladiatorial blood sport, then congratulations, because you still possess some semblant shred of human decency in an era where such qualities have become vanishingly rare on the American right. But hold on, because we're just getting started, and what I'm about to unpack for you goes so much deeper than one disgusting moment of schoolyard bullying elevated to a presidential campaign stage. Chris Christie, the most high-profile and consistent critic of Trump still in the Republican primary campaign in early 2024, became the target of Trump's cruelty precisely because he dared to challenge the authoritarian cult of personality that has consumed conservative politics. And Christie mostly stood alone in the Republican primary contest as an uninhibited critic of the party's frontrunner, which in the moral universe of MAGA politics is an unforgivable sin that must be punished not through substantive policy debate or intellectual engagement, but through the kind of personal dehumanization you just heard Trump deploy with such casual sadism. When Trump sneers that Christie wanted to eat all the time because he lost his job, he's engaging in what scholars of authoritarianism recognize as a deliberate tactic of dehumanization, and research shows that dehumanizing metaphors are a cornerstone of authoritarian rhetoric, because the goal here is not to defeat Christie politically, but to reduce him to something less than human, to strip away his dignity and individuality, until all that remains is a caricature suitable for ritual mockery. And if you think I'm being hyperbolic, then consider this absolutely chilling finding from research on political psychology, where 2 out of every 3 Americans who support one of the major parties considered members of the other side to be less human than their own party, with American partisans rating the other side as 42 out of 100 points less than human. This is not normal democratic discourse, and this is not the kind of political disagreement that has characterized American elections throughout our history. This is something fundamentally different and infinitely more dangerous. But here's where it gets absolutely explosive, and where you need to understand the systematic nature of what we're witnessing, because Trump's rhetoric is not a lapse in judgment or a matter of personal spite, but rather a governing language of power that circulates far beyond the man himself and embeds cruelty, selective outrage, and dehumanization into the political culture. And what that means in practical terms is that when Trump body shames Christie on stage, he's not just being a bully, he's actively teaching his followers that cruelty is strength, that mockery is political strategy, that the way you win arguments is not through superior ideas or moral vision, but through the ruthless targeting of perceived weakness in your opponents. Trump has normalized and sanitized nastiness and cruelty in a way that observers never thought they would see, but the normalization process is key here, because once you accept this behavior as just Trump being Trump, or just how politics works now, you've already ceded the moral terrain upon which democracy depends. Watch how Trump structures the attack, because there's a calculated sequence at work here that reveals the psychology of authoritarian manipulation. First, he establishes that Christie lost his job, which immediately positions Christie as a loser and failure, because in Trump's zero-sum worldview, there are only winners and losers deserve nothing but contempt. Then he pivots to mention the great young woman, who is phenomenal and happens to be Hispanic, which serves the dual purpose of appearing magnanimous, while also implicitly suggesting that Christie was so bad he got replaced by someone from a demographic group that Trump's base has been conditioned to view with suspicion. And finally comes the body-shaming punchline about eating, which gets the crowd laughing because Trump has now given them permission to join in the cruelty, to participate in the ritual humiliation of someone who dared challenge their leader. This is textbook authoritarian theater, where regimes frequently create images of internal and external enemies to justify repressive policies and mobilize the population, with dehumanization at the heart of this process. And let me tell you what's happening in that crowd when they laugh and cheer at Trump's cruelty, because this is where the moral catastrophe becomes collective, rather than individual. A Trump rally has the feel of an all-day pep rally mixed with a megachurch service with Trumpism as the religion, places where a movement largely defined by grievance can be together away from opponents. And in that hermetically sealed environment of shared hatred and collective rage, the normal human inhibitions against cruelty dissolve because everyone around you is laughing and applauding, so it must be okay. It must be acceptable. It must even be virtuous to mock someone's weight and employment status, because dear leader is doing it, and dear leader can do no wrong. This is how authoritarian movements colonize consciousness, and this is how ordinary people become participants in extraordinary cruelty, not through grand ideological conversion, but through the slow, steady accumulation of moments just like this one, where you either laugh along, or you become the next target. Now let's talk about what this reveals about the absolute moral bankruptcy and intellectual void at the center of contemporary Republican politics, because here's Christie, who defined his 2024 primary campaign in large part around renouncing Trump, calling his past support of the former president a mistake, and in December he described Trump as acting like someone who wants to be a dictator and doesn't care about democracy or the Constitution. Which means Christie was actually making substantive arguments about the existential threat Trump poses to American democracy. He was engaging in the kind of serious political discourse that used to define Republican primaries back when the party had some semblance of intellectual coherence. And Trump's response to these weighty constitutional concerns is to make fat jokes on stage. Let that sink in for a moment, because this is the spectacular impoverishment of political thought that Trumpism represents. When confronted with serious arguments about authoritarianism and democratic norms, the best the Republican frontrunner can muster is schoolyard insults about someone's weight. And the truly horrifying part is that this works better with the Republican base than any substantive policy argument ever could. The MAGA base is getting ever more vitriolic with its misogyny, and it's that the MAGA base is getting ever more vitriolic with its misogyny. And while that particular observation was about gender-based attacks, the broader point applies perfectly here, because what we're witnessing is the systematic coarsening of political discourse, where part of that is due to the secular dirtbags of the Joe Rogan Elon Musk variety, who have become such a loud part of the Republican coalition under Trump, and Republicans can't win without keeping those people happy, since the Christian right is where the GOP's organizing power still mainly resides. So you have this toxic alliance between performative masculinity and authoritarian Christianity that finds its expression in moments like Trump mocking Christie's weight, because cruelty has become the binding agent of the Republican coalition, the thing that holds together disparate factions who might otherwise have nothing in common except their shared pleasure in seeing perceived enemies humiliated and degraded. And I want you to understand something absolutely crucial about how this connects to broader patterns of authoritarian dehumanization. Because when Trump mocks Christie's weight, he's employing the same psychological mechanisms that authoritarians throughout history have used to prepare populations for increasingly extreme actions against targeted groups, and authoritarian leaders purposely use dehumanizing rhetoric like vermin to discuss certain groups of people, and authoritarian leaders purposely use dehumanizing rhetoric like vermin to discuss certain groups of people, because the goal is to strip away the humanity of the target until violence against them becomes not just acceptable, but morally necessary. Now, I'm not suggesting that body-shaming Christie directly leads to concentration camps, but I am saying that the psychological infrastructure being built through moments like this creates the conditions where increasingly extreme cruelty becomes normalized and rationalized. When cruelty becomes routine and dehumanization becomes common-sense language, does not merely reflect violence, it prepares the ground for it, and the endpoint of such brutalizing rhetoric is the colonization of consciousness, the normalization of state terror, and the steady march toward targeted persecution. Let me hit you with another bombshell that will make this even more infuriating, because Trump's language took on a more negative and violent tone with 1.6% of the total words uttered in his 2024 campaign, denoting violence compared to 0.6% in 2016. And overall, Trump's language took on a more negative and violent tone with a conversation analysis finding that 1.6% of the total words uttered in his 2024 campaign denoted violence compared to 0.6% in 2016, which means this is not static. This is not just Trump being Trump as he's always been. This is an escalating pattern of increasingly violent and dehumanizing rhetoric that is metastasizing through the body politic like an aggressive cancer. Heading into the final stretch of the 2024 campaign, Donald Trump used increasingly shocking and harsh rhetoric to go after Vice President Kamala Harris and to paint a picture of a country being destroyed, and the Christie moment you just watched is part of that broader escalation, where the former president has essentially abandoned any pretense of normal political discourse in favor of pure performative cruelty. And here's what makes this so strategically insidious from a political standpoint. Because Trump knows exactly what he's doing when he deploys these personal attacks, he understands that many Americans will witness Trump events through viral clips of his at times violent anti-democratic rhetoric. And that's important, but 9 years in these surreal events say so much more about the continued Trump phenomenon, which means Trump is deliberately creating these viral moments of cruelty because they serve multiple functions simultaneously. They energize his base who love seeing enemies humiliated. They dominate news cycles and social media conversations. They signal to anyone considering challenging him that they will be personally destroyed, and they contribute to the broader normalization of authoritarian political culture. This is not accidental, and this is not impulsive. This is calculated authoritarian politics where personal degradation becomes a weapon of political control. Now let's examine the Republican Party's complicity in this moral catastrophe, because it's not enough to simply blame Trump for being Trump. We have to hold accountable the entire apparatus of conservative politics that has enabled and amplified his worst impulses. Between 2021 and 2024, Trump high-profile right-wing figures, supporters, and media outlets have been accused of promoting conspiracy theories, lies, dehumanization, demonization of political opponents, threats of violence, as well as forms of stochastic terrorism. The entire Republican establishment watched Trump mock Christie's weight and employment, and their response was either enthusiastic applause or cowardly silence. When Congress began the new year, Rep. Andy Biggs gave a television interview and made a startling confession saying House Republicans have done nothing they can run on. We have nothing, which reveals that the Republican Party has completely abandoned any pretense of governing or policy development in favor of pure culture war grievance and personality cult worship. The Christie body-shaming incident also reveals something absolutely crucial about how the Republican Party has weaponized what they claim to oppose, because the loudmouth misogyny is less about expanding the Republican coalition and more about base maintenance, and it's happening for a lot of reasons, with Trump creating a permission structure. One can extend this analysis beyond misogyny to encompass all forms of cruelty and bullying behavior, where the party that claims to oppose cancel culture and defend free speech has become the primary perpetrator of targeted harassment and dehumanization. In recent months, the 2024 Republican slate has engaged in a round-robin of gendered insults and at times clumsy attempts at machismo, and in recent months the 2024 Republican slate has engaged in a round-robin of gendered insults and at times clumsy attempts at machismo, and the Christie attack fits perfectly into this pattern, where weakness, whether real or perceived, becomes the ultimate political vulnerability to be ruthlessly exploited. But wait, because it gets even more disturbing when you consider the research on how this kind of rhetoric actually affects political behavior and democratic norms, because dehumanization goes beyond disagreement and dislike, and when people are thought to be less than human, it justifies their mistreatment, and people who dehumanize other groups are more likely to support discrimination, military aggression, and using torture against them. So when Trump supporters laugh at his mockery of Christie's weight, they're not just enjoying a mean joke, they're participating in a psychological process that makes increasingly extreme actions against perceived enemies seem reasonable and justified. Growing animosity between the political parties, rising support for anti-democratic norms, and outbursts of partisan violence threaten the social fabric of our nation, which means every moment like this one, where cruelty is celebrated and dehumanization is normalized, brings us one step closer to the collapse of democratic culture. Let me absolutely blow your mind with the scholarly research on this, because the psychological impact of such language is well documented, and studies in political psychology reveal that when people are exposed to animal or disease metaphors about immigrants, they become more likely to support exclusionary or punitive policies. And this dehumanizing frame alters not only public opinion, but also moral imagination, creating a climate where violence and neglect appear justified. And while that research focuses specifically on immigration rhetoric, the psychological mechanisms are identical when applied to political opponents like Christie. The goal is to strip away empathy and moral consideration until the target is no longer seen as a fellow human being deserving of basic dignity, but rather as something less than human that can be mocked, humiliated, and eventually destroyed without moral consequence. And you want to know what's truly pathological about this moment? Chris Christie announced Wednesday that he was getting out of the 2024 presidential campaign, and Christie had been resisting calls to drop out and make room for Feely to grow her support further in recent days, arguing that she was damaging her candidacy by pandering to different audiences and by refusing to rule out becoming Trump's running mate, which means Christie had literally just ended his campaign when Trump delivered this attack. He was already down, already defeated, already out of the race, and Trump still felt compelled to kick him while he was down, because in authoritarian political culture, there can be no honorable defeat, there can be no graceful exit, there can only be total humiliation and absolute submission. 1 week after a bullet nearly took his life, former President Donald Trump delivered a speech filled with divisive rhetoric that was largely in line with his usual tone, and despite Trump having told reporters that he would pivot to a message of unity, the former president used his Saturday speech to call President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris names, refer to Biden's allies as thugs, argue without evidence that Democrats cheated in the 2020 election, which demonstrates that Trump is utterly incapable of anything resembling magnanimity or grace, even in the face of near-death experience. Cruelty is not a tactic for him, it's a defining characteristic. The replacement of Christie with a great young woman who happens to be Hispanic deserves its own analysis, because Trump is doing something incredibly cynical here, where he's weaponizing identity politics while simultaneously claiming to oppose identity politics. He's using the fact that Christie's replacement is Hispanic as part of his attack on Christie, while also trying to claim credit for celebrating diversity, and this reveals the fundamentally performative and manipulative nature of all Trump's rhetoric, where words have no inherent meaning beyond their utility in the moment, for advancing his interests and destroying his enemies. All critical discourse, but the first thought upon watching this clip is this is why the GOP is doomed in its outreach to claw back female voters they've lost in the Donald Trump era, and it's not just the assault on abortion rights which they can't seem to hold back from, despite the resounding unpopularity of the anti-choice stance, and it's that the MAGA base is getting ever more vitriolic with its misogyny, held as Tariqing, and we can extend this to all forms of diversity, where the Republican Party claims to support colorblind meritocracy while simultaneously engaging in the most transparently cynical identity-based politics imaginable. Here's another explosive revelation that connects this specific moment to broader patterns of Republican dysfunction, because in a Republican Party where Trump has maintained his status as the apparent frontrunner, Christie's narrowly focused bid always seemed to be a long-shot effort. The Republican Party has changed dramatically since McCain ran nationwide, which means the party has fundamentally transformed from an organization capable of tolerating internal dissent and principled disagreement into a personality cult where any challenge to the leader is met with vicious personal attacks designed to destroy not just the challenger's political career, but their personal dignity and reputation. This is not how healthy democratic parties function, and this is not how confident political movements operate. This is how authoritarian cults maintain control through fear and intimidation. The crowd's reaction is perhaps the most disturbing element of this entire spectacle, because these are not paid actors or plants. These are actual Republican voters who traveled to a Trump rally and chose to spend their time listening to the former president, and when he makes cruel jokes about someone's weight and job loss, they don't boo or walk out or even sit in uncomfortable silence. They laugh and cheer and applaud like they're watching their favorite comedian, rather than a candidate for the highest office in the land. Even when his particular wording doesn't make headlines, Trump's speeches are full of false and sometimes strange rhetoric about migrants, and we're going to have the largest deportation in history, he said to thunderous applause, which reveals that Trump's supporters are not accidentally or ignorantly supporting authoritarianism, they are actively and enthusiastically embracing it. They want a leader who will be cruel to their enemies. They want a politics of personal destruction and collective humiliation, because it makes them feel powerful and validated in their grievances. And let's connect this to the absolute failure of Republican governance and policy development, because while Trump is on stage making fat jokes about Christie, the record of accomplishments since Republicans took the House majority has been damn thin, and if conservatives scuttle an immigration deal, it could hurt swing district GOP members, who would benefit from achievements as they fight for political survival in competitive districts, and it would be ironic if the thing that prevented them from being able to hang their hat on a good immigration or border security policy would be the election, because it could be the only thing that might save some of them. The Republican Party has essentially abandoned any pretense of governing in favor of pure performance art and culture war grievance, and moments like the Christie body shaming are perfect encapsulations of this moral and intellectual bankruptcy, where substantive policy debate has been replaced by schoolyard bullying, elevated to the status of political strategy. Hate speech was woven through the fiery words and crude jokes of Donald Trump's rally Sunday at Madison Square Garden, an event that analysts say showcased how bigoted language has infused the Trump campaign and the messaging of many Republicans, and hate speech was woven through the fiery words and crude jokes of Donald Trump's rally Sunday at Madison Square Garden, an event that analysts say showcased how bigoted language has infused the Trump campaign and the messaging of many Republicans, and the Christie moment exists on a continuum with these other displays of cruelty and dehumanization. It's all part of the same authoritarian project of normalizing hatred and making cruelty a virtue rather than a vice. The fact that Trump can seamlessly move from mocking someone's weight to praising his replacement to attacking his enemies demonstrates the complete absence of any coherent ideological framework beyond the raw exercise of power and the ritual humiliation of anyone who challenges that power. Let me give you one final bombshell that ties this all together and shows you exactly what's at stake here, because for years polls have traced a sharp rise in the share of Americans who believe violence is a valid means to achieve their political goals, and in a December 2021 survey by the Washington Post and the University of Maryland, 1 in 3 respondents said they thought violent action against the government can be justified compared with fewer than 1 in 10 in the 19th. Which means the normalization of cruelty and dehumanization in political discourse is not just offensive or distasteful, it's laying the psychological groundwork for actual political violence, and when you train people to see their opponents as less than human, through moments like Trump mocking Christie's weight, you are preparing them to accept or even participate in increasingly extreme actions against those opponents. This is not hyperbole, and this is not alarmism. This is what the research on authoritarianism and political violence consistently demonstrates. Dehumanization is the necessary precondition for atrocity, and every moment of normalized cruelty brings us closer to that precipice. What you witnessed in that clip was not just Donald Trump being Donald Trump. It was the Republican Party revealing its complete moral collapse. It was American conservatism demonstrating that it has been fully captured by authoritarian impulses, where cruelty is celebrated as strength and human dignity is seen as weakness to be exploited. And it was a warning about where this all leads if we don't recognize the danger and organize massive collective resistance to this descent into barbarism. The question is not whether Trump will continue to engage in this kind of dehumanizing rhetoric, because he absolutely will. The question is whether the rest of us will continue to tolerate it, whether we will continue to treat this as normal political behavior rather than the authoritarian pathology it represents, and whether we will build the political power necessary to defeat not just Trump, but the entire toxic culture of cruelty that has consumed the Republican Party and threatens to consume our democracy itself.